Hello, welcome to the Uplifted Hand. Kai's not here today, so today I'm going to be going over verses 1, 3, and 4 in Ezra. Let's get into it. Boop! Now I'm over here. Um, let's get into it. So verses 1 through 4, the journey home begins. For 70 years, the streets of Jerusalem had been quiet. The city that had once been filled with worship is now laying in ruins after Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple and carried away many of God's covenant people into captivity. Children grew into parents and parents into grandparents, all while living in a foreign land called Babylon. Many had never seen Jerusalem with their own eyes. Then the world changed. Babylon fell, Persia became the greatest kingdom on earth, and a new king named Cyrus took the throne. Although Cyrus did not worship the God of Israel, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia. God was keeping a promise he had made decades earlier. The people of Judah were finally invited to return home and rebuild the house of the Lord. Now, going into verses 5 through 11, we're leaving Babylon. The king's announcement had spread quickly through Babylon, and every family faced a difficult decision. Would they remain in the comfort they had built, or would they trust the Lord enough to leave everything behind? Some had lived in Babylon for their entire lives and knew no other home. Yet the scriptures tell us, then rose up the chief of the fathers, with all them whose spirit God had raised. Those whose hearts were stirred gathered their children, packed their belongings, and prepared for the long journey to Jerusalem. Before they departed, King Cyrus returned the sacred gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Solomon's temple. The treasures that had once witnessed Israel's greatest days were finally going home. We are now in Ezra 3, verses 1 through 13. We see the first stones. After months of travel, the people finally stood within the broken walls of Jerusalem. Before they lay the remains of the city their parents and grandparents had described for so many years. The temple was gone, the walls had fallen, and much of the city was still covered in rubble. Yet instead of rebuilding their homes first, they rebuilt the altar so that they could worship the Lord once again. Sacrifices returned, prayers filled the air, and hope slowly replaced sorrow. When the foundation of the new temple was finally laid, two very different sounds echoed across Jerusalem. Many shouted aloud for joy, and many wept with a loud voice. One generation celebrated a new beginning, while another remembered the beauty that had been lost. Now we're entering Ezra 4, verses 1 through 24. We see opposition rising. The joyful sounds of rebuilding had barely begun with new voices entering the story. The people living around Judah offered to help rebuild the temple, but they worshipped the Lord while continuing to worship other gods, remembering that idolatry had once led Judah into captivity. Zerubbabel, we'll get there, knew God's house could not be built upon compromise. His answer was respectful but firm. The neighbors quickly became enemies. Encouragement turned into intimidation, whispers became accusations, and letters were sent to the Persian king. Soon the order arrived, and the work of the house of God ceased. The unfinished temple stood quietly once again, waiting for the day God would call his people to continue the work. Now in Ezra 4:24, we see silence. The city had been waiting for this moment for 70 years. God's people had left behind the comfort of Babylon, crossed the wilderness, rebuilt the altar, and laid the foundation of a new temple. Their songs of praise had filled the streets of Jerusalem once again. Then, almost as quickly as the work had begun, it stopped. The tools were laid aside, the voices grew quiet, and the unfinished temple stood as a reminder that God's work is not always completed as quickly as we hope. Yet the silence was not the end of the story. Though his people could no longer build, the Lord had not abandoned them. In his perfect time, he would call them to rise again and continue the work he had begun. The work of the house of God ceased. That was a lot, all in one, but let's listen to the Come Follow Me. We're building despite opposition. The people of Judah discovered that following the Lord meant trusting him long before they could see the finished temple. They chose worship before comfort. They chose worship before comfort, obedience before convenience, and faith, even when the opposition seemed stronger than hope. Their story reminds us that God's work is not measured by how quickly it is completed, but by our willingness to remain faithful while building it. The same invitation is extended to each of us today. The questions that we're going to go over are, what great work has the Lord invited you to build in your own life? And why do you think the people rebuilt the altar before rebuilding their own homes? Thanks for listening to The Uplifted Hand. I'll see you tomorrow.